and the rest of the world. And I know we'll get into a little bit of that, those plans as they affect the US economy or expected to affect the US economy with this very distinguished panel. But I just want to setting the scene. We know, of course, that over the last few years, indeed over some time now, the US has been the outstanding economic performer in the global economy, sustained growth. It's recovered its pre-pandemic growth level. Picture. That's not to say, of course, there aren't challenges. Inflation remains a continuing challenge, a continuing threat, still well above the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. As a result of that, of course, and doubts about inflation, great uncertainty about monetary policy in the US, where it's headed. The Fed has started cutting rates, but there's great uncertainty about how much further, if indeed it does go any further, and what may be next and what that may mean for the US. And of course, that's reflected in what we've seen in financial markets in the last month or so with since the Fed started cutting rates. In fact, in September, very significant increase in bond yields. So there are challenges. With itself a list of opportunities and challenges that some would say for the US economy on everything from immigration, energy, tariffs, of course, and we'll get into that, what that all may mean. And I couldn't let this go without also talking about the kind of new era that we have of what might be called Elonomics and the putative existence of a oligarchy in the United States now, and what that might mean, if it's true, for US economic performance and indeed for US civic affairs over the next few years. Anyway, we've got this very distinguished panel, very brief introduction, though they don't need any introduction. To my left, Brian Moynihan, you know, Chairman and CEO of Bank of America. James Quincey, CEO, Chairman and CEO of Coca-Cola Company. Vicky Holub, CEO of Occidental. On the far left, Rich Lesser, CEO of the Boston Consulting Group. So a real people right at
kind of in the spirit of the U.S. So the financial crisis came out faster because they basically wrote down the assets in the capital markets. The second part is the capital markets that can absorb activity and promote activity. And the third, and you mentioned it a little bit, is the consumer-led economy and in the consumer spend. And so the stimulus in U.S. that went to the customers to basically pave over the hole created by the recession after the pandemic, all that money end up going back in the economy. It has a multiplier effect to it. So, that's the thing. And then innovation, if you think about what's going on, the number of new companies forming, the number of business formations, the amount of capital that's going into AI, or you pick the topic of the last few years, clean tech, AI, et cetera, is just massive because the investment pools are big and the capital's there and it gets rejuvenated. And then we can't forget that the
companies to move at the pace.
Right, let me exploit the moderator's privilege here and play devil's advocate a little bit and offer you sort of what some people might say, kind of slightly cynical observation. While all of those things that you've all said are true, there are some big factors that have been big contributors to US growth over the last 4 years in particular. A massive fiscal deficit. US has got a fiscal deficit now of close to 7% of GDP. That's after a long expansion with an unemployment rate of just over 4%. That's extraordinary and unprecedented. The last time the US has had a fiscal deficit on that scale has only ever been in wartime or in the midst of a deep depression. So we've had massive fiscal contribution to demand growth. We've had migration, significant migration. The labor market
can actually get ahead of that. We've done this at different times. So I think we can do that. We have to take it very seriously. And that's something. All the other issues you have are real. I think this issue is a little bit more isolated away from the innovation, dynamism stuff, because the private sector can't do much about the debt. It has to be managed from the central sector.
What about the rest of you on these? So whether the debt or whether migration or whether, again, this concentration of extraordinary financial growth that's occurred as a result of the boom, the tech boom, particularly around those companies. Anybody else want to weigh in on the questionable durability of those factors?
Look, I think they're all factors. I think Brian was very clear when saying, the debt can't continue to outgrow the economy endlessly. But that's also true. I mean, if we're comparing the US to Western Europe, UK, as a former UK, more or less, he's still hanging in there. Our GDP,
a proud American, James, as he is. Well known.
Well known.
The accent may last, but the citizenship
the passport's changed.
Yeah.
UK government taxation is at a record high since the Second World War in the UK. The UK deficit is not that far off the US. Ditto France. Ditto interest rate. Like the package of things that need to be managed by the government is very similar in Western Europe. So that's not the big factor here. There was just as much going on in Europe as well. And so I think it is the demonstration of the dynamism and the structural advantages.
Vicky and Rich, you want to weigh in?
Well, I think it gets back to one of you got to have the fundamentals, you got to have the foundation of an economy that can be there and that's not susceptible to other economies in the world. I mean, we have a lot of independence, not just with energy independence, and I think that's really, really important.
Rich?
I just want to come back to the people part of what you said. I think it's so important. Part of the dynamism in the US is because it's a magnet for talent from all around the world. So when you say that could be a reason, I think it most certainly is. Is that an excuse for the illegal immigration or the undocumented, whatever language you use, for the last few years? No, I don't think it is. I think that there's no question that the American people broadly, sure not everyone, but the majority for sure, would like to see illegal immigration stop. I think it most certainly is. Is that an excuse for the illegal immigration or the undocumented, whatever language you use, for the last few years? No, I don't think it is. I think that there's no question that the American people broadly, sure not everyone, but the majority for sure, would like to see illegal immigration stop. But our ability to preserve a culture where you can attract real talent from around the world legally into this country and use them to help fuel, whether it's fueling technology on the one end or just the massive need for construction work with all the construction that's got to happen in this country after all the disasters, the housing shortage, the infrastructure build we need to do. We shouldn't underestimate our ability to attract talent, the US ability, as one of the important contributors. And I think if we were to shut that down, then there is risk.
Brian, you want to say something?
So, Vicky, being in the business, it's hard for her to talk about it in some ways, but think about what you said, tracking 2010, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's innovation. The oil and gas industry at 5 million barrels or something, a high cost of production, a lot of regulation around it. It was all innovation allowed that to reach. And then it busted in 15, 16 because the tail got, not the big company, the tail got hit hard because price came down and we wrote off a bunch of loans and recovered a lot of it, but it fell on its back for a while. And then it came back a different way. So that literally, and then emissions in the United States actually went down year over year. So you put this equation together, which is pretty wild when you think about it, of going from 5 million barrels of production to 13. Consumption, what was it, 2010 consumption? I'm not going to quiz you, but you assume it was half what it is today or 3/4 or something like that and growing. And yet emissions going down, that's the innovation around use of and capture and other things. It's a pretty interesting story, but it has a failure in the middle of it, a partial failure. The wells that went into production off the fracking that didn't make it were big.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing it up because now you give me an opportunity to clarify a little bit. And that is that in Southeast New Mexico, when we first started drilling in the shale, giving it our best effort in about 2009, 2010, those wells made 200 to 300 barrels a day. And we were thinking, oh my God, we got to spend this much money for 200 or 300 barrels a day. It's uneconomical. But we stayed with it, and the industry stayed with it. Quite frankly, they were the independent oil and gas companies, not the majors. The majors weren't going to mess with it. The independent oil and gas companies, with the help of Schlumberger and others, thank you for that. There was an effort to make sure that we applied innovation as we were going. And, a lot of companies develop technologies, and they can develop technologies in the lab. Pharmaceutical companies can develop medications in the lab. What we knew is that to do it quicker, we had to do our research in the field, drilling the wells, and then seeing what they would deliver. So some in the investment community thought, my God, you're wasting all this money. But what did it get us? It got us to this 13.5 million barrels a day, and it got us to wells that now deliver 70 to 80% return on each well. And that was the innovation. The innovation was, and Rich has talked about it a lot, there was a lot of ingenuity, innovation, a lot of incredible ideas. And even today, we're continuing to make it better. We're continuing to make our wells better and to find different ways to produce it.
Let's move on to, again, the risks that we can look forward to, as it were, in 2025. We've talked a little bit already about the fiscal picture. Brian, you've talked well about that, and that'll come up again in the context when we discuss some of the things that Trump wants to do. But inflation, that seems to me to be the continuing big question mark. It's come down, obviously, from its peak of 2021 significantly, from down consumer prices down from 9% a year on average down to around about 3% now, depending which measure you want to use, but still comfortably above, as I said earlier, the Fed's target. The Fed's cut rates now signaling the rates cuts are not going to be as much as we thought. Let me start with you, Rich, on the other end. How much do you, I mean, it's how much further do you think we have to go, both in terms of the inflation number, but perhaps more importantly, in terms of monetary policy, before we do get down to a level that we can generally recognize as consistent with price stability?
I think we'd like to see, Brian, I would defer very much to Brian on how many rate cuts is the right number, but we're not there yet, and we need to bring some more. I think we're carrying, you asked a question about risk, and just to come at it, the way I think about it right now is we're living in a world of a high base and a high beta. The baseline for the US economy is strong. Partly because we carry great momentum in, partly because there's a lot of lined up investment that's set to come, and partly because we're almost certain to face an environment where there'll be some relief on regulation and at least a continuation, if not some additional relief on taxes. And that combination should give the US economy a lot of momentum. And the high beta, the uncertainty around that, is the combined risks that would make it harder to reduce inflation, interest rates, and would put upward pressure on inflation, which is the intersection of the deficit and will we really be able to cut spending more than we cut taxes, the pressure on labor, particularly depending on how deportation plays out, and the pressure from tariffs depending on how implemented and how substantial. And all of them implemented to some degree might be stimulative, might take the strong base and make it stronger, but they also have a chance to make it harder to continue the positive momentum path we've been on. And so I think that's what we're going to see play out over the coming months and next couple of years of how that combination of forces goes. But the baseline starting point is strong, and I think the baseline, if we can keep it going, will be a few more interest rate cuts, and I think that would put the U.S. economy on a very strong path.
Brian, as the designated banker, do you agree? So when the Fed cut rates in September, according to its own projections, it was expecting rates, the Fed funds rate, to fall to around 3% by the end of this year. Obviously, market rates have gone completely the opposite direction. 10-year yields are up 100 basis points, while the Fed funds rate has come down 100 basis points. Now the Fed's, projections suggest, maybe it's currently about 4.25, by the way. Maybe it'll come down to 4, just a little bit below. What's your sense, Brian, and how close are we to dealing with the inflation problem and getting those rates further down?
So the inflation takes time to get out, especially for the pieces that are still there, which is around housing, because the ability to build housing is restrictive, and it's some of the other sort of market-derived metrics, so-called owner's equivalent rent. These technical terms mean something to a lot of economists. But so our team always thought it'd be the end of 26 till we saw inflation get close to the low 2s. And they never thought about it. What's happened is the economy's been stronger, and they've been upping their estimates for GDP, like at the end of 24 and into 25 from they would have had this time last year, they had this part of 25 basically 0.5% to 1% growth, maybe 1%, and now they're 2.5%. So they've upped it. That's substantial in the United States, a point. And so they've upped a lot, and therefore they've taken our team, our research team, which is very strong, and they've taken all the cuts out this year, and they believe that end state is probably 4-ish. They moved up to 3.5. They probably think it's closer to 4-ish. So that would imply a couple cuts out there as they see it. And it'll be the 24-month period we're starting now where you'll finally see inflation come in. And, as we look at from our customer data, which is James and others, if you look at from the customer data, the customers are spending very consistently with an economy that grows at 2% and inflation at 2%. They're spending about 4.5% of the money's going in the economy out of our customers' accounts. First half of January versus last first half of January. They're employed, they have money in accounts, they have the ability to borrow, but they're being very rational how they're spending. And then, that's good because it's a solid base, Rich's point. And this summer I was a little more worried they caused the consumer to back off. When rates went up and the consumer said something's wrong, they kind of backed off. And then they came back in as the fall. And minute they said rates come down, the confidence went up and the spending went back to the level. So what we see on that side, the piece that in the U.S. that we have to be careful is this rate structure actually affects small, medium-sized businesses more than anybody else. And they're still under a very restrictive rate regime because they went from 50 basis points plus their spread to 450 basis points plus their spread. That is a massive borrowing difference. And that they use lines, and they're not using them as much because it costs more. That's holding back development. And as the rate structure meanders in, and people, frankly, anybody under 40 has not seen this. So it's going to take getting used to. This is normal. What wasn't normal was the 15 years since the financial crisis. If you go back the 10-year, I think the number is 70% of all the days it traded from World War II to now is traded at 4.5. They're around 4.5. If you go back since 1790, so we're in the third bear market for 10 years, and it always moves up around 4.5, 5, and sort of stops, except for one period when the nominal rate environment in the 90s was really high. So this is normal.
And the strong investment performance also raises the equilibrium interest rate too. So, that's another reason why you'd expect to see rates high. James, just quickly from the consumer's perspective, we have got mortgage rates basically back up over 7%. Other debt that is, student loan debt, some of that, Brian mentioned, small business borrowing. Are you seeing any pullback at all by the consumer recently?
I think there was a pullback from the consumer, but it was more in the summer. I'm more with his thing as the rates came up, and as the remortgaging came in, or the student loans came in, or people could see things happening. Just that change of dynamic, I think, got their attention coming out of the second quarter. Third quarter was a bit slow, and I think the momentum has stabilized. People have kind of, okay, maybe this is the new normal. I mean, real wages are increasing. Real wages weren't increasing that long ago. So once you got real wages increasing, inflation's not there, but it's approaching to. I think people are like, okay, maybe interest rates are going to go from 5 to 4.5. Maybe that's the new normal. But once you get to a status quo, that's the new base. And so I think actually there was the slowdown, and I think the momentum is reinitiated.
All right, so let's move on to some of the other risks. As you know, and this brings us neatly to the Trump question. As you know, there are some economists who think that even with inflation stubbornly above where we'd like it to be, with a fiscal deficit stubbornly above where we'd like it to be, Trump's going to come in committed to a massive tax cut to renew essentially the 2017 tax cuts, plus some extra tax cuts on top of that, with obvious implications for the fiscal deficit. He's going to impose tariffs, probably, across the board, certainly on some countries. He's going to dramatically deal with inward migration, going to cut immigration. And we just talked about here is all these things that have been important contributors to US economic performance over the last 4 years. And to some extent, these are, especially, relatively strong labor supply are bulwarks against inflation. Vicky, let me start with you. And of course, but we can get into his energy plans too, although I'd rather not sort of deal specifically with the energy plans. But those policies, do you see these Trump policies, the Trump second term policies, assuming he gets tax cuts, tariffs, and significant reduction in immigration, is that a net positive for the U.S. economy, or is it going to cause a surge in inflation or create other economic problems?
I think the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is the continuation of that is going to be positive for the economy. I think it was previously. I think it'll be that way again. I think he's going to find enough things, cuts that he can make to offset that. And I think for the first time ever in our history, I do believe that there will be significant changes to the cost structure of the government. And if you make significant changes to the cost structure and the staffing of the government, there are going to be programs that go away. So I think it's going to be positive.
Can I just very quickly ask you about energy? Because Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, has Donald Trump's ear, by all accounts, has set this very interesting 3-3-3 target, he calls it. He wants to get GDP growth up to 3% from around 2.25% that we seem to have as a trend now. He wants the deficit down to 3% from, as I said, the 6.5%, 7% we have now. And he talks about increasing oil production in the US by 3 million barrels a day from the 13.5 million we have currently. Is that feasible, Vicky? And that's a 20 to 25% increase in oil production. Is that feasible? And how sensitive is the price if the US is going to suddenly increase its supply in that way? How sensitive would the price be? Give us your sense of how achievable that target is.
It's achievable given the resources that we have and our ability to execute. Would it be the right thing to do in this year? It would not, because right now we're still in an oversupplied market. We've got to let some of the spare capacity get worked off. Then we have to, at that point, I think we can look at growing our production again meaningfully. So I think production in the U.S. is going to increase by maybe 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day, 2025 to 2026. But I think it's going to take some additional monitoring, some additional reduction as we of the spare capacity, and then the demand is still going up. So I think by the end of this year, first of next year, there will come a time when we would be able to execute that and achieve it. And I think he didn't give a timeline. Thankfully, he didn't give us a deadline by the end of the year or anything.
There's
So
an
we're
old
good.
economist. There's an old economist saying, isn't there, when you're giving a forecast, either give a number or a date, but never both. Right? That's the key to good forecasting. James, I'm going to ask this question because we just talked about it backstage. But I have to say that Donald Trump, the Wall Street Journal reported today that one of the very first things Donald Trump did other than the inaugural speech and the executive orders, the hundreds of executive orders, he reinstated the Diet Coke button in the Oval Office so that he can have a ready and immediate supply of Diet Coke. Don't let that in any way color your answer to this question. But how do you view Trump's economics?
He's got a virtual button we can.
How do you view this picture that we've painted of Trump's economics? You know, tax cuts, obviously, tariffs. We'll get into tariffs in specific detail, I will. But what's your overall picture? You optimistic?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we spent the first 10 minutes talking about how the US had been the outperforming economy and how optimistic we were for the future. And he's Donald Trump. I thank him for being a consumer. He's the 25th inauguration we've seen since the start of the Coca-Cola Company. I hope it works. Why would I not want it to work? I mean, I hope it works. There's a lot of puts and takes, things that are pro-growth, savings that they want to make on the efficiency side. I hope the package comes together and hits the 333. I mean, that's what we all want to have happen.
What do you think affect tariff? A 10% or a 20% across the board tariff imposition of tariffs would have? What effect would that have? I mean, on your business? Maybe could be very positive, presumably, because there'll be that Mexican cola nobody will be able to afford anymore. But what do you? What's your? I mean, more generally for the economy, I can't find many people who are enthusiastic about a big across-the-board imposition of tariffs.
Well, look, a couple of things. First, it's all very hypothetical at this stage. There's not actually an instruction to do X. So it's very hard to argue a hypothetical question. Second, it's not in isolation. There's a whole load of other things happening. I mean, one of the reasons they said they wanted tariffs was to get rid of income tax. I mean, you can't slice a package and say, I hate this bit and I love this bit. The thing is going to come in a totality. And are we optimistic about the future, looking at the totality of the measures they're going to bring out? For us, it's not a direct, massive impact. It'll affect some of the things we buy. But the Coca-Cola Company, at the end of the day, virtually all the Cokes you drink in country X are made in country X, whether that's the US, Europe, Latin America, anywhere you go, we're making the Cokes locally. So it's not a direct impact. But I think the key is to think of all these things in its totality. Are the totality of the policies going to deliver the growth we all want to have happen for the US?
Rich, let's stick, if I may, despite James's plea, stick specifically to the tariff question.
Sure.
And you deal with international businesses, and you're very familiar, long experience with the way global trade and global economic relations work. How do you think the US economy is going to respond if we do get a very significant increase in tariffs?
I think, well, I agree with James that you have to look at a combined set of things. When we've modeled through just the tariffs alone, but the extreme end of it, not necessarily I'm not arguing where we'll negotiate out to all of this, but if you just took 60 on China, 25 on Canada, Mexico, 10 on the rest of the world, it comes out to about a $700 billion. We've got a quite sophisticated trade model. It's about a $700 billion net impact on trade before retaliation, which you assume you'd get some response on the other side. So that would be impactful. That would have some positives. It would certainly raise a lot of revenue. It might allow for other things to happen. That would be impactful. It would probably have some inflationary impact. We don't know because exchange rates and other factors come into that are very difficult to model in advance. And that's a transitory inflation. That's a one-time step up. It's not that adds every year. I think if you combine that with a large number of deportations, if you combine that with a substantial increase in deficit spending, you could get into a scenario that would be quite concerning. But I would be very hesitant to project that future. I sort of where James is. I think the hope is that in the end of the day, the bundle of things that will happen, whether it's related to labor, continued attracting of quality talent into this country, the getting the right negotiation level on tariffs, the right progress on the deficit, that overall will be a positive outcome. But I think if you paint the extremes on all the things that were talked about on the campaign, then you could get to a different place.
Brian, is that your view? Is it a negotiating tactic?
Well, that's clear because it was last time. I mean, and they said.
Well, he did actually impose tariffs last time.
Yeah.
So it's not like we're talking the abstract.
Yeah,
here.
no,
we do have the experience of tariffs. What happened when he imposed tariffs on China?
It was a negotiation. Remember, it was negotiated on a bilateral basis to get China to buy more of certain categories of
But
goods.
the tariffs went in, and indeed on many goods are still in place. Biden kept them in place.
And they kept them in place. No, so our team, when they look at it, they think broad-based tariffs of 10% or so kind of get messed up in and don't have a lot of impact. As you go up more and more, at Richard's point, you start having impact, and then the question of what's the offset. I think the natural governors you're going to have on this is really, if the incoming Treasury Secretary said 333, if your goal is to hit all three, you're going to have to make trade-offs from the precision of what you said before, based on very practical outcomes, right? So the idea that you're going to have a 3% growth. Matter of fact, remember the economy grew 3% in the third quarter of 2024. This is just maintaining. It's not actually. That's the main thing. So I think they'll have to make those trade-offs. Is a tariff too high to slow down that growth immediately? Is it 3 million barrels the wrong thing because it's actually going to hit the price of oil, which actually creates more trade imbalance, honestly, in the U.S. because of the way that works. So there's all these different trades, and I think, but as you're pragmatic, the big difference when you ask, why do our people think the tariffs don't happen? They think the burden of regulation and deregulation will offset that. And literally, we just did a survey among our small business people of 6 months of surveys, and the regulations is what was their biggest complaint. Then it was inflation. That's actually come down now, and now it's shortage of labor. So if you're going out in the economy and talking to people out there, and they say, "I can't get labor again," what are you going to do on immigration policy? You're going to try to figure out how to solve this question, not end up with millions of small businesses saying, "This is my problem," and why don't you solve it for me? So these things do play off each other, but our people don't think tariffs are necessarily inflation producing in a moderate amount, but they're depending on the deregulation to create other efficiencies in business that sort of effectively allow them not to pass them through and croak the consumer.
So it sounds like you all agree that tariffs, obviously doesn't sound like you're fans of tariffs, but you all think that the proposals Trump have are, one, negotiable, and two, even worst case scenario, not necessarily going to do that much damage because they'll be offsetting factors. So you don't buy at all. The economists generally believe that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s were a major contributor to global depression. You don't really think anybody think we're in danger of repeating that historic mistake?
Nope.
No,
because people talk about that.
Okay, move on very quickly. Immigration. Little story. So I was waiting in line. I went to my favorite sandwich shop in New York City the other day. I live in New York City, and there was a line out the door for the sandwiches. I had to wait in line for about 20 minutes for sandwiches. One person working at the register, somebody turned to me and said, "This is what America's going to be like when Trump deports all the migrants, don't you? Because we're not going to have any workers." Let me ask you, Vicky, first. If you are serious about not only stopping immigration, to some extent, by the way, we've seen that since the Biden moves of last summer, stopping all illegal immigration while allowing a certain amount of legal immigration, and deporting millions of people who are already here, where's the labor going to come from to achieve 3% growth?
Well, I think, like Rich, that if we have a challenge, we're going to meet it. And I disagree with allowing illegal immigration to continue. I think they have to be removed. So we're, as a country, just going to have to figure that out. I could say, just to tout a company in the state of Texas, go into a Buc-ee's and see how many people that they can feed in 5 minutes. So people are going to figure it out. We're the United States of America. We'll find a way to make it work. Right now, we're going with the easiest, simplest solution, but that's not where we have to stay.
But press you. Again, if you're able to significantly cut inward migration into the United States, especially illegal migration, do you think the U.S. has sufficient, unutilized labor resources to fill that gap, especially without any kind of significant increase in
or
the wage level?
Innovation. Now, the street, the guys that are on the sidewalk selling things, that's a different thing. But I'm talking about to be able to meet the needs of the United States people in whatever way, whether it's food services or whatever service it is. I think we can meet that challenge, but we're going to have to do it with innovation.
Brian, where are the workers coming from?
I think that's why I said what's entered the minds of small business. I'm not going to have the workers to operate, and so we have that comes back to the questions where they can get to solutions. 20 years ago or whatever, there was a proposal put on by the Gang of Eight, so-called all senators. I think 6 of them are still in the Senate and alive, that laid this out, bipartisan stuff. So there's been lots of solutions, but nobody's ever taken it on. So I think America is a place where opportunity is recognized. If I got it right, you're an immigrant that's become a citizen. So, by the way, somewhere in all our histories, probably up here, we can draw that equation, whether it was us directly or others. That's the way it's been. But it was a controlled environment where people sort of kept control of, as opposed to a massive influx that people weren't sure of. That's, I think, the tension that's in the system, not necessarily that people coming to America to achieve the opportunity is not a good thing, because a lot of people are talking about it. Their families came to America or they came to America.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people overstate some of this. At the end of the day, it's simple math. 4.1% unemployment is low. And then if you go into construction, if you asked a construction person who builds stuff, they'd say, I'm at 0% unemployment.
Yeah.
And so it's not like so they've got to figure it out with innovation someday, but that takes a little longer than just saying, hey, we got to figure out how to get the right people here, make sure they come through the system, make sure the system is set up to absorb them. That's the other problem, where you get reactions that cities and towns can't absorb the flow.
We're almost out of time, but I want a very quick question. Any of you can answer this. Maybe I'll put Rich on the spot. One of the advantages you didn't talk about, one of the key structural advantages the US has had for a very long time, is stability, the rule of law, respect for the Constitution and for the law, and incredibly, 250 years of an established Constitution. Do you worry at all? Some people do. Some perfectly, sensible people do, are not kind of crazy sort of Trump haters. That maybe what we've seen in the last few years, you could argue maybe from both sides as well, because Joe Biden has done a lot of extra constitutional things. Is that faith in the US as a stable constitutional republic, is that weakening?
I think, let me start with my own view. I have a lot of belief in the resilience of the United States. I think we are living through a time of enormous change. You live in the media world. We see how people consume information and where they get it and how different it is. Like, we're in the midst of a massive geopolitical reset that's been happening versus 30 or 40 years of a trend we were all on that's shifting. So it is a disrupted time. That does raise stress this last campaign period, but you're right. Over many years, there have been things from multiple angles that have raised concerns, and there are concerns. And I think it's incumbent on the politicians of both parties to ensure that you listed it better than I could, but all of the attributes that have been so fundamental to the long-term success of this nation stay robust. And I put it on our political leaders across the board to sustain that. And yeah, I think there's when times have changed, people always stress. And when we've gone through the highly divisive period we've just had, of course, those stresses are even higher. And now we need to all work together to build the foundations for the next wave of American growth.
Anyone else want to comment on the possible decline of the collapse of the republic?
So there was an election, and there are people shot because of who they endorsed. There was a vice president within a few years was brought up on treason. It was the election of 1800. The United States has gone through this stuff. So the question is, you go back and forth and find a balance, and things swing and swing and swing and swing. But in the end of the day, the massive middle of America sort of has a view of the country that I think people can appeal to in either party at time to time, but that massive middle moves the thing around at the margin. And so you go, Karl Rove has written some great history things. So that's the election in 1800. You go to Abraham Lincoln had to sneak in to Washington because they thought he was going to be shot on the way in.
That one did result in a civil war.
Yeah, but he thought he was going to be shot before he took office.
Yeah,
and he didn't think they were going to certify the election.
That's because he was going to,
And so
deprive the states.
We fought that war, and we're still here.
Very quickly, because we are almost out of time. But I do want to ask you, each of you, very, very quickly, this. One of the things Trump did yesterday in his executive orders was essentially to take very clear aim at diversity, equity, and inclusion, as it's called. This has been a big deal for America, for the rest of the world to some extent, favorite of Davos, I know, and a big deal in all of your companies. I think all, to some extent, you've all followed DEI policies. There does seem to have been a backlash against it, a political backlash against it. Trump's doing this. He's got a lot of support for it. Very quickly, all of you, is DEI, as it's come to sort of dominate so much of corporate thinking in the last few years, is it dead? Brian, quickly.
I think at the end of the day, our job is to create opportunity for the 200,000 plus people and 1 million family members behind them. And I don't think anybody disagrees with that.
Meritocracy rather than DEI. Yes, James?
Same thing. We are huge international, over 200 countries. We need lots of people with lots of different skills and abilities. We need them to collaborate and work as a team. And it's a meritocracy, it's equal opportunity.
Vicky?
I believe the same thing. We have a corporate conscience. We care about people, and we treat people the way we would want our family members to be treated.
And Rich, last word.
I think it's a very diverse country, and we need to create an environment where people feel included, and it needs to be a meritocracy where everybody has the opportunity to succeed, but the success that you have as an individual is based on merit. And I think some of the language of the last few years will get adjusted, but I think that intent to make it work for a wide range of people, of hundreds of thousands, to make it work, and then to create an environment where everyone has the opportunity to succeed, I think that will last.
That we are out of time. So I think to conclude, I'd say DEI is dead, the Republic will survive, and America will continue to dominate the world. What better outcome could we possibly have? Thank you all for being here. Thank you.